So we'll start with the registration, which we have completed. Then we'll have an intro by the speaker. Then we'll move on to the workshop itself, followed by a Q&A session. After this Q&A session, we will play a small Kahoot game and you all can win prizes. Then it would just be the mass photo taking and then dispersal. So if there's nothing much, we can start with the intro by the speaker. Sham.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Sham. I'm a student at NTU as well, currently pursuing computer science. I've been taking photos for about 4 years now and I love it. And recently I've gotten into freelance photography as well. And for the past 1.5 years, I've had about 40 clients. And my favorite type of photography is landscape photography. This is some of my socials where I've posted more of my work. If you'd like to check it out, you can at your will. So if there's nothing else, Dhanush, can I start sharing screen? Okay. Can you guys see my screen? All right, thank you. Okay, so when you first open Lightroom, these are the main modules that you will see. So for the sake of this tutorial, we just have to focus on the library and the develop module. So how we begin is we just have to start importing our images. So just have to choose file, import photos and videos. And you can choose the folder where you have the pictures you want to edit. By default, the photos that haven't been imported yet will be auto-selected by Lightroom. If you'd like to manually choose them, you can just uncheck all and choose them one by one. But yeah, so let's just go ahead and import it. So now the images are in the Lightroom library and you can go about editing the photo by just clicking the letter D after choosing a photo. So let's start off with this. At every point, I might jump around here and there. So if you guys have any doubts or if you're confused about certain parts, you can always ask me to repeat it. So there are several options. This is the main develop panel and there are so many options for you to modify your photo. But I will mention the main sliders that you would require for most of your images. So let's start with the curves adjustment layer. So this curves is actually more simple than people make it out to be. So all you need to do for most photographers, they just think of making S curves with their curves adjustment. So for that, you just have to add a point here and another point here. And so this area of the curves pertains to the highlights of the image. So highlights pertain to the more brighter parts of the image. So for example, in this, his shirt would be, his shirt would be the highlight because it's pretty white. So, and this area would pertain to the shadows, which means the darker parts of the image. So for example, this railway structure. So to form the S curve, we just have to bring up the highlights ever so slightly and bring down the shadows slightly. So as you can see, when you do this, what we're doing is we're you're adding more contrast to the image by making the brighter areas more bright and the darker areas more dark. So you can stop here at the curve with the curves, but my suggestion is you just go one step further and make use of these 2 points at the ends of the curve as well. So I don't know if you guys have seen those images with this vintage look to it. How they achieve that is they basically increase the, so if you bring this slider up, you are essentially you're crushing the blacks of the image. And if you bring this slider down, you are crushing the whites of the image. So what this means is when you bring this black slider up, it adds this sort of film on top of the image, which basically tries to tie the whole image together. So for most of my images, I actually bring this slider up slightly, but it's based on your personal preference. Editing is very subjective, so you can bring it up higher if you'd like. And by bringing this white slider down, you can essentially make the colors more soft. So obviously you don't want to overdo it. So because when you overdo it, you can see that you lose a lot of detail, especially in the shirt. So you might just want to keep it very, very subtle. So that's about the basic curve. So for most cases, you can just stick, for most of your images, you can use these 2 points at exactly this position. And you can just move these 2 points based on how you want. It will vary from case to case, basically. And yeah, so that's basically how it forms the S curve. There's a more in-depth version of the curves where you can adjust each color, but this is more advanced and I wouldn't recommend it unless you have a good idea of color theory. But personally, in my experience, this general curve is more than sufficient for most of your images. So next, let's go back to the main slide. So this portion is the white balance. This temperature slider, as you can see, will help you decide how warm or cool you want your image to be. So if I slide it towards the yellows, you can see that the image is getting warmer. And if I slide it this way, you can see that it gets colder. But in general, most of the cameras these days have very good white balance meters. So they'll automatically be able to do this portion for you. But if you have a certain look that you're going for, then obviously you can adjust the temperature as you wish. The tint, similar to the white balance, the tint would just help you add either a pinkish hue or like a greenish hue. Suppose my image is very green because of some issues in my sensor. I can always fix it in post by just bringing up the pinks slightly. Okay, so after that, yeah, before that, so Adobe provides you with different color profiles. So you can play around with these, but in my opinion, just stick with Adobe Color or Portrait. So for this, I'll stick to color. Exposure, I'm sure most of you know, is just a slider that helps you to correct any, like if it's too bright or too dark. So if I want to make it a bit darker, I can slide it this way. And if I want to make it lighter, I can slide it this way. Contrast is similar to what we did in the curves adjustment by increasing the highlights and decreasing shadows. So if you actually move the contrast slider only without doing this curves, you have lesser control as to how much you want to adjust your highlights and shadows. So if you're lazy, I guess you can just use the contrast slider. Highlights and shadows are similar to what I've mentioned here. So I probably won't be showing you much of that, but if you guys just want to see, 1 second. Okay, so as you can see, this portion is darker, like the frame of the railway. So if I increase the shadows of that, more of that is visible now, and basically it helps you bring out details in the shadow regions if that's the look you want to go for. Uh, for this image, I want to reduce the details here and bring more attention to the subject. So I'm going to bring the shadows down. Whites and blacks, as the name suggests, if you bring this white slider to the right, it's pretty illustrative here. So if you bring it to the right, it would be the white parts of the image would be more white, for example, like this. And if you bring it to the left, they would become less white. In the blacks, if you want to bring it to the left side, they would become more black. And if you bring it to the right, they would become less black. Yeah. Now let's move on to the clarity. Often you might notice that, say, your photos are out of focus and you might not have noticed that while clicking the image, but later when you edit, you realize that it's slightly out of focus. So these sliders will help you bring that detail back. For example, if we move in and see their face. So if I increase this texture slider, it will try to increase clarity in the edges of the entire image. So for example, it will try to improve the edge of his face, this line, so, and the edge of his eyes. So it will try to bring out more detail in that. But so for example, if I increase the texture, you guys can see that there is more clarity that is brought back in. But obviously you don't want to push this to the point where it seems artificial. But you can still work with the texture slider. I prefer the texture slider over the clarity slider. As I'll show you right now. Clarity slider will essentially exaggerate how clear the image is. So if even a slight movement would make it seem very artificial. So if you see right now, it looks pretty harsh. So in my opinion, just work with the texture slider to just add a small pop to the image. Okay, next, in this photo, there's no haze, so it's not really applicable, but you suppose you have a very foggy or like misty image, you can use the dehaze slider, which works similar to contrast to like bring in more detail. Vibrance and saturation. So saturation will just increase the amount of every color. So it will just, for example, you can see that every color becomes more concentrated. Vibrance will try to affect a small change throughout the image, so it's more subtle. So if you were to go for anything, just stay away from saturation because it's, yeah, finicky. Just work with vibrance. Yeah, for this, but usually I don't use either of these sliders. So because we'll be adjusting the colors later in other sliders. Okay, so are you guys good till now? Anyone wants me to repeat anything? If you're good, just maybe a thumbs up would do. Okay, cool. Okay, next, let's go to the hues. So this is the HSL slider. So there's the hue, saturation, and luminance. Hue will essentially help you control different shades of a particular color. So for example, let's look at the greens at the back. So suppose I want the greens to be more yellowish. So in this color, in this area, we can actually see that there is a bit of yellow and green as well. So if I want my greens to be more yellow, I just have to look at the green slider and move the green closer to the yellow side. As you can see, there's like a change here. And if you want to make, you can even move the yellow slider slightly to make this change. So if you want to see a before and after, you can already see the difference in color that has changed. So that's basically what we can do with the hue and saturate the hue slider. Usually you wouldn't have to mess with this area unless in general you'll only want to correct possibly skin tones if say they are too red due to some lighting on the day. Then you can correct skin tones using this orange slider. And other than that, yeah, you wouldn't have to mess with this much. So let's go to saturation. So one trick that I employ while using the saturation slider is actually just bring down all the colors. So I have a clearer idea of what I want to have in, like what colors I want to pop more in the image. So let's do this. And then slowly I will start bringing back certain colors. For example, the reds will be in the flowers and the lips of people. So if I bring back reds slightly, yeah. And then oranges and yellows are what affects people's skin tone. So perhaps we don't want the skin to be too orange. So we could just bring in very slight orange. Yellows seem fine to me right now, so I'm not going to touch them yet. With greens, so if we want our greens to pop more, perhaps we could increase that a bit more. Obviously, all these are your personal preference and everyone's editing style is different. So you have to just try and figure out what you like. So it doesn't really matter what someone else tells you about your images. So in this image, I don't really see much blues. So I feel like I should just reduce that. Purples as well and magenta. Okay. So just try to make the image more desaturated at this point, because later we will be increasing, we'll be adding like a global saturation increase. So for now, let's just keep it slightly muted. So let's just look at what we have so far. So it's a slight difference than what we had before. So luminance now is how bright you want each color to be. So as I've mentioned previously, orange and yellow control skin tones. So if I increase the orange slider, you can see that it brightens their face, right? So, but you need to be careful, because if there are other parts of the image that have oranges, they will increase in luminance as well. These all are global adjustments, so they will affect the entire image. Also, you don't want to overdo the luminance as well. So suppose I increase the luminance too much, you can see that slowly you're losing detail in the image. So you just want to keep it reasonably good. And for yellows as well, you can just play around, see what works. Once you're happy with that, you can just go ahead. Mostly you wouldn't need to work with, oh sorry, yeah, this could highlight specific parts of the photo. Yeah, you're right. So you can work with other colors, but mostly like purple and magenta, you wouldn't see much of those colors in this scene. But if you're working with a scene where there's more purple and magenta, you could essentially play with those as well. This photo doesn't have the sky scene, but basically the sky, as you all might know, will have a bit of blue, right? So if you want to affect how so suppose the sky is so white that you can't see anything, you can try to bring down the blue slider. And essentially what this does is it reduces the brightness of the blue in the sky, and you can see more of the blues in the sky. Basically, you can recover some detail. Yeah. And yeah, that's pretty much it for luminance. I'll move on to color grading. Okay, so this is a very, I would say, an advanced topic in Lightroom, and I don't, it took me a while to figure it out, but I can just give you guys maybe some tips and tricks on how to work with these. So to make it easier, just instead of using this, just click on these three dots. So for example, this would be the shadows, this is the midtones, and this is the highlights. These are global adjustments as well. So for most of your images, you would only need to work with highlights and shadows. You can avoid midtones because we've actually worked on the midtones in the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. So for the highlights, I'll just show you guys what it does, and then maybe you can, then I can explain. Yeah. Okay, so you can move the slider around like this to see what it does to the image, or you can just work with this slider as well. So for example, I want this image to be such that I took it on a very bright day. So I want it to be more warm than cool. So more warm tones in the highlights. So the brighter areas would be something like orangish yellow. So somewhere around there. So once you're happy with that, you can set how saturated you want it to be. So if you want it to be super saturated, you can see that it basically like tints the image. For my work, normally I stick between 10 and 20. You wouldn't need to go higher than that in general. And if your scene is quite dark, perhaps you could use luminance as well to bring out more of that color. But in general, you wouldn't need to use this as well. Yeah, then let's go to the shadows. So the idea is to choose, so highlights and shadows are can be treated opposite. So for example, I chose my highlights around this area. So I should choose my shadows on the opposite end. So somewhere here. So that's a trick that I follow. So it's always important, at least what I follow is I reduce the shadows, like my shadows are less saturated compared to my highlights. So once you are happy with the selections that you've made, it's always important to go back and see what you have so far. So you might the point of color grading is basically to round out the colors of the entire image to achieve like a certain level of consistency. And at any point, if you feel like you've done too much, you can always go back to where you liked it and then work from there. So right now I feel like maybe the model's faces are too bright, or like the dress is too bright, so I can't really see much detail. So we can always go back and correct that. using the highlight slider. Remember, I mentioned that highlights are the brighter parts of the image. So in this case, it would target this. So if I bring it down slightly, you can see that some of the details in the shirts are coming back. Sorry. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so that's with the color grading. So mostly mostly you would only need the highlights to be around the orangish area or the bluish area, depending on the kind of look you're going for. And if you don't like shadows, you just don't have, you can omit the shadows. It really doesn't matter that much. Okay, yeah, so that's about color grading. And yeah, so sharpening is similar to clarity, except actually sharpening is similar to texture. So it tries to add a certain level of basically adds more pixels around corners of the image. So what you have to do for sharpening is first you can just increase it to a certain amount, any amount, and then you have to hold Alt or Option key, depending on whether you're a Windows or Mac user, and drag this masking slider while holding the key until you can just about see the parts that you want the sharpening to happen for. So for my case, I want mainly the subjects to be sharpened. So I'm happy with about there. And if I let go, this amount that we've sharpened only happens to those areas that was shown by the mask, like this. Yeah, so that's something that is good to follow. Additionally, you might have images that might be very noisy. By noise, what I mean is, okay, let me just skip to this photo and zoom in. So can you guys see there's a lot of these grains on the image? This happened because I shot it during, I shot it at a place where there was very low light. So your camera tries to like compensate for it, and you'll end up with these grains in the image. So to correct that, you can use this noise reduction sliders. So the main two sliders that you need to take note of are the luminance sliders and the color slider. So first, let's do the color slider. So color slider, what it does is it tries to reduce the noise in the specific colors of the image. So it might not cause a big change in the overall noise here, but it's always good to bring up the color slider slightly to make the colors more soft and more pleasing to the eye. So this slider is the main slider where you can see a big difference. So for example, if I bring this up, you can see that most of the noise has been removed. So if you see a before and after, you can see the difference. However, you need to understand that as you bring up this, it makes the entire image soft. So you need to basically strike a balance between what you think looks good and not overdoing it. So yeah, that's basically the luminance slider. So suppose I'm happy with this, but I see that the models actually have lost a lot of detail in the image. So that's where your sharpening slider comes in. So yeah, so you can just adjust and bring back a few of the details that you might have lost. So for example, if this is 0 and it's a very slight change, but yeah, you can always, I mean, I will show you later certain parts that you can manually select instead of making it global. You can basically select the subject and edit them alone. So for example, if you want to bring the detail back into the subject, you will be able to do that. But I will show you that shortly after. Let's go back here. So are you guys okay so far? Do you guys need me to explain anything again? All good? Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. Okay, so this is the normally when you click your photo, depending on the camera you click it on, whether it's your iPhone or any other DSLR, your Lightroom will auto be able to select, it'll auto detect the make of the device, and it will compensate for any distortion that might have been created. So because of the lens of the camera. So for example, so just know that you have to just check both of these options, and it will try to correct any issues that might have been in the photo. So if I remove the correction that Lightroom has made, you can see how it was straight out of the camera, and the photo is kind of curved. So this way it helps you correct the perspective. And this slider will, so vignette essentially means vignette helps you to draw attention to the subject. So a vignette would be, for example, just imagine like an oval shape around the subject, and the adjustments will be made to the area around the oval. So for example, if this is my oval, it will be to the area outside it. So for example, if I bring the vignette down, you can see the outside areas becoming darker, and attention is being brought to the subject. So depending on your photo, you can just play around with this and figure out what works. So right now I'm happy with this. So let's continue. For this transform as well, suppose you click the photo such that it's slightly tilted. You can use just use the auto slider, because Lightroom does a pretty good job of correcting and making the photo straight. So as I click the auto, you can see that it will correct itself. So yeah, just use that. And yeah, all these sliders are just if you want more control over how you want to fix it, but in my opinion it's not needed. So you can just play around with this, but just use auto. Yeah. Okay, next would be, yeah, this is similar to the vignette that we saw here, but this would give you more detail, more control over the how much you want the outer area to darken or lighten. So for example, if I decrease this too much, you can approximately see the circle where the changes have been made. So you can always change the midpoint of the circle. So for example, if I slide this out, you can see that the circle is getting bigger essentially, and lesser parts outside the circle are undergoing the change. And you can also set how round you want the circle to be. So if you can make it such that it's more boxy, or make it more circular. Yeah. Feathering is just how feathering will help you in terms of smoothing out this uh, change. So as you can see, it's kind of gradual here, but if you decrease the feathering, you can make it more abrupt, something like this. So in general, you want the feathering to be high, so it's more a gradual change. Yeah, that's basically it. But in general, I don't think you would need this. If you do need it, you can just make the change in this slider. Yeah, but if you want more control, you can use this slider. So we're about the end of the actual color correction part. So this is where I mentioned earlier that I mentioned earlier that we should choose a more muted tone first, so that later in the end, all you have to do is go to the blue section and increase the saturation of the blue primary color. So it will essentially, it has a nice way of rounding out all the colors and just add a small pop to the image. The rest of the sliders are, yeah, it's just for the different colors, but in my experience, you wouldn't have to use it much because these are more finicky and they might affect skin tones as well. And yeah, you don't want artificial looking skin tones. So just work with the blue primary most of the cases. Yeah, so this is basically the color correction part. Now, all these adjustments that we've made are global adjustments. So perhaps we could do, so there's the most important part and one of the most useful parts of Lightroom are these like few functions that we have. So for example, you look at this, this model has imperfect like blemishes on their face that you can help get rid of using this this healing tool. So you just choose the size of the brush and you can select the area. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, so if you select this area, Lightroom will auto suggest a location to replace with, which they think would work, but sometimes they don't give great suggestions. So suppose I'm not happy with this, I can always move this around to a place where I feel looks better. So I'm happy with this. Now I can go to the next area and I can just move it around to see what looks good. So yeah, once I'm happy with this, I'll just go to the next slider. So this is the healing tool. Next is the red eye correction. You can use it if your model has a red eye, but in my opinion, in my experience, I haven't really faced that issue. This is just a crop tool that you can use to basically see how much you want to crop in or crop out. Or you can even rotate by clicking outside like this. Once you hover outside the image, you can see that the pointer changes to a left and right turn. And then you just have to hold your mouse and turn it left or right based on what you want. Okay, so that's with crop. Now let's go to masking. These are the most powerful tools in Lightroom. So for example, okay, let me show you masking with this model. So for this case, when I clicked the photo, the background was super bright and basically you can see there's little to no detail in the background, and I want to bring some of that detail back. So without affecting, so if I were to do changes in the global adjustments, it would affect the model's face as well. But I don't want to affect her face. I just want to affect the background. So how I can do that is click on masking and then use the select subject mask. So Lightroom will auto help you select the subject that it thinks is the main part of the image. And right now, the red portion basically tells you that this is what's selected. But for my purpose, I want to select the outside area instead. So you can just use the invert option and it will help you select the outer area. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that the whiter parts of the image might be either the highlights or the whites. So you want to reduce that. If you reduce the highlights, you can bring back more detail. So if I reduce the highlights, you can see that some of the detail in the background is coming back slowly. And if I reduce the whites as well, whites, if you reduce it, becomes a bit more dim. So usually I don't touch it much. So yeah, so you can just reduce the highlights slightly. So suppose I feel that this isn't enough. I want to reduce more of the highlights, and there's only 100 here. So you can just add a new mask and do this. You can just you can just copy the same mask again, duplicate it, and essentially it's now there are two levels to it. So this is layer 1 and this is layer 2, and yeah, so you can just use that again. So I'm essentially now getting 200 levels of control, so I can bring more of the background detail in. Now say I want to now make her face more bright. I can select subject again, and this time it selects her, and I can just increase the shadows because remember I mentioned that the shadows are the darker parts of the image. So I want to bring back more detail to her face. So I increase the shadows. Yeah, so that's basically how you can use some of the masks. So that's for select subject. You can also do select sky, but this might or might not work sometimes. So it's not very accurate yet. So for example, you can see here, it's actually highlighted a bit of Marina Bay Sands as well, which is not ideal. Oops. Yeah. So yeah, so if you want to use it, you can, but in general, you wouldn't need to use it. Yeah, and then masking, let's choose another mask. Okay, so okay, so we also have the brush tool. This offers more control over the image. So for example, let me go back to this and zoom in. Okay, brush. Okay, so I can just paint over portions of his face that I want to basically either brighten up or reduce clarity so it becomes more soft. For example, in this case, say he has a lot of blemishes and I want to correct them. I can just use this slider to correct it. Show you. Yeah, so for example, I decrease the clarity. It will versus, so normally it's like this. If I decrease the clarity, you can see that some of the blemishes are becoming softer. So if I reduce the texture as well, this is how you can clean up the skin a bit. So that's another use for the brush, but obviously you can do more things than just this. It depends on what you would like to do. So I can, if I just want to add to certain parts of the image, I can say I want to add like some light that's coming from here. I can just add like some layer here and essentially increase the exposure. So it like adds another dimension to the image. Maybe I want to make it a bit warm. Yeah, so if you go back to what we had in the start, so this is what we have achieved so far. Additionally, there's a few more that I'd like you to know. Yeah, so linear gradient is basically, it helps you add, it'll basically help you add corrections in like array kind of format. So for example, you can see that the red is more concentrated below and it fades away as we move above. If I spread out this more, the red is actually, the concentration of the red slowly decreases. versus if I bring it very close, then you can see that it's a very abrupt change. So yeah, so using this, you can do same adjustments. So if I want to bring more attention to the face, I want to make the lower areas darker. So let's do that. I'm making the lower areas darker. So naturally your eye is drawn towards the subject. So something like that. And other than that, there's another slider. Maybe I can show you on this photo. So this is a shot of the Milky Way that I took in New Zealand. We can use so right now there's so much going on that you can't really easily identify the Milky Way. So we could use the radial gradient for that. So this is like similar to the vignette. So for example, you can choose the area that you want to affect, and you just so for my case, I don't want to affect the actual Milky Way but the area around it. So I'm just going to invert it and basically reduce the exposures so that my eye is drawn towards the actual Milky Way. So something like this. So if you see a before and after, even this subtle change helps you highlight the subject of your image. Yeah, then so even for this photo, for example, so that's basically it about these sliders these masks that you need to know. The other two is generally not used as much, so you can just focus on these 5. For this image, for example, you can just make it better with a few sliders. So if you guys remember, I mentioned that white balance is just basically the balance between how warm or cool the image is. In this case, it's very obvious that the image is very warm because of the color of the church. So perhaps I could just move the slider to the other side and essentially fix the color slightly. And while I do that, you can also see that the sky gets a nice blue color. Now in this, right now, I still think that this area is too red. So we can just go to the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders and reduce the saturation of the oranges and reds to a point where you're happy. So for me, somewhere around there. Yeah, something like that. So basically it's all about what you want the image to look like and working from there. Yeah. Yeah, additionally, suppose you don't want to start from scratch, like say you want to edit a few portraits and you want the same sort of style to be applied to all your images. You can just click this plus icon in your presets. So first you need to make a change, like say I've made all these changes, and then I click plus, and then you can just create a preset. You can check the options that you want to include in the preset based on all the changes that we've done. But in general, you can just leave all this checked as it is. And you can name your preset, for example, preset 1, and just create. You need to understand that presets will not work for all your images. So you might still have to adjust them slightly. So just for fun, I'll just apply the same preset to this. As you can see, the same kind of color is applied to this image. While it might not be very good straight off the bat, you can always correct it. So you can like bring up the shadows, and just like that, you can, it already looks much better. So yeah, presets are just here to make your life a bit easier, if that's what you'd like. Yeah, then the last thing we just need to do is to know how to export an image. just choose the export option, and yeah, then just scroll down, choose the image format as JPEG, and max out the quality, put it at 100, and change the image sizing from 240 to about 300. And yeah, you can just click export and view the image later. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Is there anything else, any doubts that you guys might have? If not, we can go to the Kahoot. Okay, if it's all good, then I'll stop sharing.
So now we open the floor to any questions you all might have. So if you all have any questions, you guys can just put it on the chat or switch on your mics and ask Shyam.
I stop sharing first, huh?
Hi, Shyam.
Hello.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It was nice to see a new application which you used to do photo editing. So do you always go through such detail when you take photos for your clients? Does it always involve a lot of detail, or does it really depend on the project?
Yeah, mostly. So basically, when you edit a lot, you will essentially figure out your own style. I don't know if you've seen some of the Instagram accounts where they essentially apply the same kind of filter or like the same kind of edit to all their images. But since you're doing client work, it really depends on the scene. So for example, if the day is a bit gloomy, then you might want to have a more cool tone, and you might have to edit such that the images are more cool versus like a warm day. So when you edit a lot, you can ideally create certain presets for yourself, so you can like fasten the process of editing. So I can say I have a few presets for that would work well in bright weather, or like presets that would work with more greenery versus like buildings, stuff like that. So that way you can like fasten your editing process. Yeah. Did I answer your question, or?
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
No worries.
Or does anyone else have any other question? All right, then if there's no other question, then we can move on to the next segment of our workshop, which is the Kahoot session. We'll stop the recording at this point of time.